Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist. I'm here today with Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and Larry Tranel, Northeast and Southeast Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic. So welcome back to the show, Fred and Larry.
Thank you, Jen. Appreciate being here.
I appreciate it as well.
So Larry, today's topic kind of focuses on some of those articles that you have recently published, focusing on dairy profits. And one of those is understanding and valuing labor. So as we take a look at labor efficiency, that's a very important part of the farm success, as labor costs and the availability continues to be an important issue. And when I get on farms, that labor is always one of those topics that comes to the forefront as far as hiring and, just making sure we're efficient, whether that's family or hired labor. So I noticed on your, that publication, you had a beginning quote on there, and it states, "Live and work not like the others when young, so you can really live not like the others when older." So could you just take a little bit and explain that in terms of labor on the dairy farm?
Yeah, sure, Jen. So when people are young and early in their career, I think there's two things that are happening. The first is that they have the value of time on their hands, which is part of the reason the money that one makes early in life might be some of the biggest money that they ever make, since they can invest that over a longer period of time. The second thing I think going on is that young people tend to not have a lot of assets, thus it's truly their labor that they have to be able to turn into money by working for money, and then hopefully they can invest that money that doesn't need to be spent. So they have that time value of both their labor and their investment. So I think labor efficiency is extremely important to both the young and old alike. But thanks again to that time value of money, I think it deserves a very special attention for our younger dairy producers.
Yeah, most definitely. And your data collection shows a strong correlation between the labor cost per hundredweight and profitability. It was, twice as strong as purchase feed cost per hundredweight and profitability. So can you share some of those examples of what this might look like, and for a young producer just getting into dairying?
Yes, I think that strong correlation that you mentioned, a 2-to-1 labor cost versus the profitability. So that was in a set of organic dairy farms across the country, spanned 4 years worth of on-farm data. And so this isn't to downplay milk production per cow or feed costs per hundredweight equivalent or anything like that, because we realize that some of those are extremely important as well. But labor efficiency becomes even more important over time to the success of that dairy farm, as both that labor cost and even that labor availability continues to be more difficult and more important. So as an example, in farms that differ greatly in their labor efficiency, so whether it's in that feeding system, the milking system, or some other type of system they have, there are producers that spend often twice as much time doing a particular task compared to another producer. So my challenge is that young producers can't always afford that low efficiency in their chore task unless changes can't be made sometimes, where they just can't afford it, they can't cash flow it. But it's important for them to try to make those changes if they can, because again, that money that they make early in life might be the most important money they have.
Larry, as you mentioned, there are three main areas that control how labor efficient dairy farms can be: the milking system, the feeding system, and the housing system. Not only do they control how labor efficient farms are, but also have a significant impact on milk production, which also drives profitability. Let's focus here on just the milking system, as that's where much of the time gets spent. Give us some examples of different milking systems and their efficiencies.
So first of all, just the importance of the profitability in the milking system itself, and as it relates to milking production, is basically, the time spent in the holding area, the time spent away from feed, it can have a big impact on the milk production. So that's one of the pieces there. But it's good to focus on the milking system, as that's often what I see as the biggest culprit in lack of labor efficiency, as we see some stall barns and small milking parlors that are only milking 22, maybe 30 cows per person per hour. And then we have small to medium-sized parlors that might milk in anywhere from 25 to 45 cows per person per hour. And we realize, or need to realize, that we have some parlors right here in the state of Iowa, like some of our low-cost trans-Iowa parlors that can milk 60 to 85 cows per person per hour. And much of the reason they can do that is because of that parlor design and some of that cow flow, because there's a lot of what I call cow psychology designed into those milking parlors to make them more efficient or to help the cows flow a little bit better. And so I think there's a lot of parlors just that need some remodeling, and oftentimes it's some very simple things at some pretty low cost to help improve that cow flow, that cow psychology, and thus their labor efficiency. So I think for producers wanting more information regarding improved milking efficiency, I think any of us would be happy to chat with them about it. But the bottom line is that that milking system is an example where one producer might be twice as efficient labor-wise as somebody else just in getting their cows milked. So one producer shared with me just after making a change that, saving an hour per milking twice a day after his remodel meant around $11,000 a year, or $730 a year, hours a year, excuse me. So that's working 50 hours a week. That's the equivalent to saving almost 15 weeks of somebody's labor. So it's not insignificant for us to try to do this. So no matter how one looks at it, I think that labor efficiency in the milking system makes a huge, significant difference in both time and profit.
Where do robots or automatic milking systems fall into this labor cost or efficiency? Are they a viable option?
So I think robotic milking is no doubt a very labor efficient option that can also be cost competitive, just as important, but it really depends on the operation. So I think for many, it might cost another dollar, sometimes $1.50 or so per hundredweight to milk their cows. But for many, depending on how labor inefficient their present operation is, they might be better off than they are now. So when we compare robots, the issue is usually what are we comparing it to? So a robot has a tough time when compared to a very efficient low-cost parlor system cost-wise. However, it may shine well relative to other systems. And Fred, part of the issue, as you well know, is the difficulty sometimes in working with labor, sourcing that labor, and just managing that labor. And there are many variables at play here. So for producers questioning if robots may be the answer for them, I think we have a pretty good spreadsheet available to help them discern the variables at play when they're considering robots.
Yeah, Larry, it seems like there's many options to consider now that, we're bringing in the factor of automatic milking systems, the low-cost parlors. There's lots of different ways that we can milk cows these days, and it really comes down to a lot of it personal preference. But like you mentioned, those critical factors, looking at the cost and labor flexibility, along with those other management factors and whatever their goals are for that operation. So those are really key to look at before considering some type of milking system. So Larry, if you could you look at all those systems that you mentioned out there and kind of give us the rundown or your recommendation for consideration in terms of efficiency?
Sure. So when people have questions on any of the milking systems, I tend to run them through what I think are all the best options. And so we have low-cost parlors, we have medium-cost parlors, we have parlors that are self-built, we have them coming from manufacturers, we have rotary parlors, we have robotic parlors, we have rotary robotic parlors. And so there's a lot of different systems out there. And I think bottom line is that I like to try to go through all those options with them, because I think some that want to put in a low-cost parlor, we go through all the options, they end up putting in a robot. I've got some other examples where people have me come out to the farm and they think they want a robot and they end up with a low-cost parlor. So as you mentioned, Jen, I think it's critical that we look at that family's goals specifically, their management ability, their desires, and their labor costs, and the flexibility of that labor, and just I think the availability of labor, which is one of the reasons why the robots are coming in. So some people think they put in robots for freedom and might find out that they might even be more tied to the dairy operation, believe it or not, than they were before. Okay, so that's not the experience of all, but it has been the experience for some. So the experience and the results of all those milking systems, I think, is pretty unique to each individual farm, as one succeeds while another doesn't perform so well. And I can say that with all the various milking systems available, that some are more successful than others. It really depends on which farm we put which milking system.
We realize that the milking system is generally one of the most pertinent to comparing farm analysis and rations to benchmarks. But there are other systems on the farm affecting this as well. How animals are handled, type of feeding and manure systems used, crop production, calf and heifer raising. Can you talk to us a bit about these?
Yes, I think milking system is often the most important, but cow flow and cow comfort is so important in all the facilities that we have. And dairying, as we know, I always call it a materials handling business, no doubt. So as a producer, one is handling equipment, you're handling seed, you're handling chemicals, you're handling fertilizer that's to be grown into feed. We handle that feed from the field to the storage. We handle it from the storage to the cow. And then the cow deposits that manure that needs to be handled, and we're right back to putting that stuff on the field for the next crop. And so dairying is undoubtedly a material handling business that takes lots of labor and equipment to try to handle it. And then we have this trade-off between the cost of the equipment maybe versus having more a labor efficient means of handling the crop, the feed, or the manure. So cattle handling, I think, is often an area where simple management things might be able to be done to be more labor efficient as we work with our facilities, whether it be the feeding, the cow movement to and from the parlor, and things like that. We also have our calf and heifer programs, which are another example of a lot of labor that goes into those systems. So just to throw out an example, and I could talk about a lot of different examples, but here's one. Let's just talk about rotational grazing, for example. So it's a technology that I'm surprised that we don't see more of in Iowa. And yes, we most often lose some milk production per cow, but to have a herd or even just the heifers harvesting 30-35% of their own feed for the course of the year, and also spreading that much of their own manure, coupled with some cow health benefits and some other maybe environmental benefits as well, I think it still remains a practice that's worth considering, especially for a young producer starting out with more limited assets or limited resources to try to get going. So overall, yeah, I think labor efficiency should be considered just in all those areas that we mentioned, and sometimes it's easier getting an outside set of eyes to take a look at some of that stuff for us.
And Larry, as we walk through some of those different systems, you know, the calf and heifer, the cropping, and you know, the repro side, the milking side, they all come with their own set of benchmarks to help producers evaluate how they're doing, where we can see areas for improvement, or maybe where we're kind of shining through on our farm. So what kind of labor efficiency benchmarks do you use to determine the level of labor efficiency?
Okay, I tend to think that all dairy farmers should do a full financial analysis each and every year, and I hate to actually do a lot of recommendations on farms until we actually do a financial analysis to see where they're at. But to try to determine what producers are making per hour worked, just like a job in town, how many dollars per hour you're making working and managing your farm. And then I like to look at total costs of labor per cow. Hopefully it's over less than $800 per cow. We've got some operations that are under $600 per cow total labor costs. And then there's a percentage of the total costs that go into it. So if 20% of the total cost that you have in your farm operation is 20% or less, I tend to call that a pretty labor efficient operation. And if it's less than 30, you're probably about average, but you start getting more than 30% of your cost into your operation that's part of labor. You know, I think there's probably some issues to work with. I also like to see producers selling anywhere from 1.2 to 1.7 million pounds of milk per full-time worker. But many of these benchmarks, I think, vary greatly depending on the system, how many acres per cow we have and things like that, or we have separate benchmarks for grazing herds, for organic herds, for more conventional herds as well. And even the milk production per cow, we would have separate benchmarks for medium production per cow versus high production per cow and things like that.
In your publications, you also mention some farm psychology or the power of positive reality. Help me understand this mindset.
All right, I'll try to do it in a little synopsis, but this is like a 3-hour talk here. In my past 31 years in extension, I mean, I've seen a lot of successes, but also more failures to succeed than I would have expected. And lots of it, I think, is truly due to positive psychology and just the resilience with which some managers respond to negative situations, but they respond with positive attitudes. So just recently, we had the derecho storms in my territory from down to the southwest here. So one family in particular just had their farm buildings pretty much wiped out. And yet I was met when I visited that farm at the kitchen table. I was met with smiles. I was met with positive determination that this family was going to make the most of it, despite all the hardships that they were going through. And I just said, they actually surprised me. You know, they could feel sorry for themselves. They could play the blame game that life isn't fair, etc. But they tried to very well convey, and not just try, but they did. And even though they had their moments, just they try to convey those positive thoughts, which truly plays into them having positive feelings about themselves and their farm, which often turns into positive actions, better decision making, and things like that. And so I think if we keep our positive focus, and this isn't me, this is just a lot of psychologists who have put in a little train of thoughts together. So if we keep positive focus with our thoughts, it often gives us a more positive definition to the things that we feel, both of which are often precursors to us having positive actions, positive behaviors, and thus it tends to turn into a more positive reality for us after all is said and done.
Larry, the things you've highlighted today make us think a bit closer on labor efficiency and realize that there are many ways to achieve this. Any final comments you'd like to add before we conclude today?
I guess just to re-stress the importance of reviewing the labor efficiencies, and not just the labor efficiencies, but the profitability of your farm as well. And I think sometimes we're the worst consultants, Fred, on our own farms. And as we see our farms, you know, through the lens of this is how it's always been done, or this is, I think, the best because it's where our comfort level is. So to get an outset of unbiased eyes might give other ideas of different ways of doing things, and hopefully more labor efficient as well, and to improve our profitability. And we realize that, yeah, we've had some tough times in dairy these past 4 to even 6 years, and this last year has just been very difficult for so many. And how do we try to stay positive and try to mitigate the stress that we're all experiencing, and try to do it in positive ways, because those positive ways tend to help us make more better decisions. So I like to tell people, just force yourself to smile even when you don't feel like it. Otherwise, these negative feelings can rule our days to the detriment of our own personal well-being, and also, sadly, to the well-being of those that are closest to us.
Yeah, some really great points there, Larry. And, you know, just thinking about 2020, we've really definitely seen some, you know, ups and downs in the dairy industry, and, you know, different natural disasters happening, and then COVID-19. So, you know, taking all this into our mindset going into 2021 as we look at our outlook, and taking into consideration some of these things that you brought up today, you know, the mindset, the labor efficiency, taking a look at your overall benchmarks on your dairy operation are pretty critical, and, you know, setting some goals for yourselves coming into 2021. So I want to thank you for coming here today and bringing this information. I do want to note that your Dairy Profit series can be found on our Extension Dairy Team website. So I'll include those here at the end of the podcast, those links, so people can further read those in more detail. You know, there's lots of information on those, you know, taking a look at those labor efficiency benchmarks and looking at those spreadsheets. So a lot of detailed information that could be further read into. So as always, you can reach out to myself, Larry, or Fred for any further information or questions. And I want to thank Larry and Fred for both being on the show here today.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
And thanks again for joining us today, and look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.